on which the world order must be based. Rules-based world order. Nothing specific. So with resolution intended not to be implemented, how can we expect that it would?
Israel has now killed...
No applause?
Israel has now killed many of Hamas's commanders. Do you think it has any real reason to continue fighting, or is it just causing carnage, death and destruction deliberately of Palestinians?
Well, we strongly condemned the terrorist attack on the 7th of October last year. But at the same time, we strongly condemn the way Israel reacted, basically by starting a collective punishment of the Palestinians. I discussed with some Israeli colleagues this issue, and well, not even in the, I think publicly, either the Minister of Defense or some other official from the cabinet, when asked why don't you take measures, you know, so that you prevent the damage to civilians, peaceful citizens, he said there are no peaceful citizens there in Gaza. As of the age of 3, they are all terrorists. And with this philosophy, and when Antonio Guterres condemned the terrorist attack and then added, but it did not happen in a vacuum. You remember what Israeli reaction was? The former ambassador demanded that Guterres resigns. Eventually he was declared persona non grata. Unbelievable. And I don't think Israelis are doing good for their own interests, because this notion that they are terrorists when they reach the age of 3 years, well, this is of course the figure of speech, but for almost 80 years, generation after generation is growing in the situation of occupation and the situation of blockade, and of course the parents and the teachers at school, people, and what happened in 1948. So unless Palestinian state is created, which unless Palestinian state is created, extremism would be breeding and breeding and breeding in the region, there is no doubt. And just to say that we will exterminate all Hamas members, I don't think it's a serious pledge.
Let's move to Ukraine, and some are there are lots and lots of proposals emerging. Can I put to you President Zelensky's latest proposal, because it seems to ease the conflict while still claiming all of the territory that he had before, but with a security guarantee rather like the East Germany, West Germany situation, with Western Ukraine being brought under a NATO umbrella. What do you make of that? Is that in any way acceptable to Russia?
Some time ago I stopped following what Zelensky says. He can change his position from A to Z overnight, depending on how he feels at this particular moment. It is not about Korean option, German option, or any other option which he calls which he says must be based without any alternative on the Ukrainian terms. Fine, then he should draw a map and see how he can accommodate himself and his fantasies. Many initiatives have been put forward, including this infamous and stupid peace formula by Zelensky, which says Russia must withdraw to 1991 borders. Putin and myself, by the way, must go to the tribunal. Russia must pay compensation. Russia must reduce the size of its weaponry close to Ukrainian border, and so on and so forth. But there are plans not coming from somebody who is inadequate, but from people who would like to help and who are motivated by goodwill, like China and Brazil moved a plan which was subject to discussion in the margins of the General Assembly last September. South Africans were circulating some ideas. League of Arab States visited Moscow a couple of times. Members of the working group they created, contact group they created on Ukraine. None of the initiatives, they're all dictated by goodwill, no doubt. We don't dispute that. But none of them mentions what President Xi Jinping of China proclaimed in his global security initiative, which he made public, I think, in February 2023. Not about Ukraine, it's a generic initiative on the principles which you must apply when you address any conflict. And one of the principles says, address and eliminate root causes of a conflict. This is key to any situation, be it lack of Palestinian state and what is going on in the Middle East, or be it Ukraine. The root causes of the Ukrainian crisis are not mentioned in any initiatives, and I met recently with ambassadors accredited to Russia in Moscow, talk about this to them, and whenever I speak to journalists or to political scientists, I always raise this issue, because to my amazement, what I'm going to say is not reported by anybody. The root causes, 2014, February, because Ukraine, to understand how the association with the European Union would affect its economic relations with Russia, just, some additional thinking, additional consultations to understand how this would affect. And they wanted to have no tariffs with European Union. And we have a lot of protection with the European Union for many industries of ours. So we told them, guys, if you open up, we have to close the border with Ukraine, because we would be flooded by the European goods, which are on most things are more competitive. And that's why Ukrainians asked for some more time to think. Actually, we suggested to EU and to Ukrainians to have a meeting at 3 and to discuss it. European Union head of the Commission, Mr. Barroso at that time, he said, none of your business. We don't discuss with you our relations with Canada. Anyway, very arrogant. So the request to postpone the consultations was used as the trigger for this Maidan demonstration, which culminated in February 2014.
Can I bring you back to the present day now, Mr. Foreign, because we're running out of time?
Yeah, I understand that you represent cancel culture.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Whatever part of root causes you don't like, you want to switch over them.
No, I think you explained.
I'm not going. Well, if we are running out of time, then I was right. You wanted to drown me in Syria.
I think these are rather important issues.
I addressed it very seriously. Briefly, this confrontation between the president and the government was resolved with Germany, France, and Poland witnessing and guaranteeing the deal between the government and the opposition, and next morning they took all administrative buildings. And the deal signed the night before said we create a government of national unity and go for early elections. And when they took the administrative building, they said, please congratulate us. We created the government of the winners. not of national unity, winners. Then they said, their first announcement was, we will cancel the status of the Russian language. They sent armed groups. But this all is cancelled. We were only accused, you annexed Crimea. No attention to the fact that Crimeans held referendum. They said territorial integrity. A few years before that, they announced unilaterally, without any referendum, independence of Kosovo, and said this is in line with the UN Charter because which is the right. So was the basis for decolonization, for awakening of the people who understood that. By the same token, the people whom Zelensky, in an interview before the special operation, called not people but species, and publicly said those who live in Ukraine and feel associated with the Russian culture, get out to Russia. These people do not consider Zelensky and his regime as legitimate masters.
Mr. Foreign Minister.
And the last point, human rights. This you cannot interrupt. Article 1 of the United Nations. Irrespective of race, gender, language, or religion. In Ukraine, since 2017, 5 years before the special operation started, they passed legislation, piece by piece, exterminating legally Russian language at all stages of education. In media, Russian TV outlets were closed. Ukrainian TV companies who were broadcasting in Russian were closed. They were storming libraries and throwing out books in Russian language, like Hitler did. And then recently they passed a law prohibiting the canonic Ukrainian Orthodox Church, thus violating the Article 1 of the Charter, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of language or religion. Our Western brothers and sisters, who on any occasion, on something which happening in any part of the globe, including Antarctic, with penguins and others, put human rights on top. They never mumbled human rights in relation to Ukraine, whether a racist regime has been breeded by them. So those are the root causes, and I hope the people who sincerely interested in promoting some solution and would be drafting some initiative would concentrate on the things which I mentioned, including, of course, non-NATO. NATO wanted to create a stronghold in Ukraine with the plans to build naval bases on Sea of Azov and on the Black Sea. They were eyeing Crimea, and when all this was stopped, you see, the reaction is really hysterical.
Foreign Minister, my final question. We have the ATACMS missiles being used by the Americans. We have Russia now using its new hypersonic missiles. We have lots of nuclear talk. How dangerous is this moment right now, in your view, in your long career as a person at the top table of global diplomacy? And do you hope that the arrival of the Trump administration can turn the page?
Well, I cannot speculate about the policies which the Trump administration would eventually formulate. There are many rumors, many testing ground statements. As regards the danger, it is dangerous, and I hope you can at some point interview somebody from the Biden administration, because everything they do indicates that they persuade Europeans they push them farther and farther, providing an example like the British more aggressively involved. They also pressure the Germans with Taurus, as far as I understand. And, once Mr. Kirby, who is strategic, communicator of the communications at the White House, he was asked whether the U.S. is concerned about possible escalation. He said, yes, we are, because if nuclear weapons are used, Europe would suffer. Mentally, he cannot even think about the fact that the U.S. can suffer. With this mentality, it's very reckless for the current administration to push Europe. I hope reason would prevail. There are wise people in the United States, and we hope that they would be taking the final decision and not those who play with fire.
Sergey Lavrov, Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera for the 2024 Doha Forum.
That is unlawful, that it must be brought to an end as soon as possible, and the United Nations General Assembly has of course said that that means within 12 months of September, so by September of next year, that it is in violation of the right of Palestinians to self-determination, that the settlements must be dismantled and settlers repatriated to Israel, that Israel is in violation of Article 3 of the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which prohibits segregation and apartheid, and there must be restitution and reparation for Palestinians. But equally importantly, what the advisory opinion makes clear is that third states are under an obligation not to recognize as lawful Israel's presence in the occupied territory, duty not to render aid or assistance to Israel in maintaining or entrenching its presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, critically, a duty to distinguish in their dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the occupied territories, and a duty to cooperate with the United Nations to bring the occupation to an end as soon as possible. So that is an absolutely critical and seminal opinion by the International Court of Justice. There have been two other cases before the International Court of Justice, two contentious cases. The first is South Africa versus Israel, in which I was instructed, in relation to which the court found that there was a real and imminent risk of prejudice to the rights of Palestinians not to be subjected to acts of genocide. And having found that risk, the court ordered 3 sets of provisional measures against Israel, with which Israel is required to comply, and they include to ensure, for example, humanitarian aid to Gaza, to allow fact-finding missions into Gaza, and to ensure that the Israeli military does not commit acts of genocide, including killing and harm. Equally seminal, but sometimes overlooked, is the case of Nicaragua versus Germany, which is critical because it looks at the obligations of third states, in particular Germany, in relation to the aid and assistance or complicity by Germany in what Israel is doing in Gaza. And whilst the court didn't order provisional measures in that case, it did make some very, very clear pronouncements. It took the opportunity to reiterate the obligations on third states under Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions to ensure that the Geneva Conventions are upheld even in conflicts where the state in question is not itself a party, and also the duty to prevent genocide. And what is so important and so interesting about that ruling is that the court saw it particularly important to remind states of their obligation relating to the transfer of arms to states involved in a conflict where there is a risk of violation of the Geneva Conventions or the Genocide Conventions, and the court made clear that they apply in the context of Israel's attacks on Gaza. And then finally, as you will all know, there are the arrest warrants that have rather belatedly, but at last, been issued by the International Criminal Court, including a warrant for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including starvation. So there is not a problem in the sense of there are legal processes, they are being implemented, they are being sought, but the difficulty is, and the critical problem that is facing not just the international institutions, but also the international legal order at present, is the failure by states to comply with those rulings and the failure by the international community to ensure that they are upheld, that has really led to a crisis point at present for international law.
So you have sketched out the word of the war has been unprecedented right from the moment. There is so much that is unprecedented about this war, and so too on the legal front. Would you agree that unprecedented, that so many of the world's top courts, so many of the sharpest legal tools the international community have been wielded, but as you've hinted, they haven't really moved the dial. They haven't achieved what they're intended to achieve, which is justice. They've been mocked, they've been ignored, the courts themselves are not recognized by all the world powers. Briefly, do you have any other legal tools in your toolbox?
So I have just come here actually from the Assembly of State Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It was being held this week in The Hague. It was a bleak and somber affair. You had the President of the International Criminal Court addressing the Assembly of State Parties, talking about the extraordinary and unprecedented situation facing the court, the coercive measures, threats, sabotage against the court, which she described as being an existential threat to the court. And it's very difficult to disagree with that assessment, but not only that assessment as it applies to the International Criminal Court, but to the international legal order as a whole. And it's in significant part, as I said before, due to the failure by the international community to seek to hold Israel accountable for what it is doing in Gaza. There is more that can be done. There are 5 things that I will set out very briefly that can be done, because now it really is the moment for states, for international lawyers, for civil society to push back, to try and ensure that the international legal order, the international rule of law is not trampled upon, but comes out stronger, because the future, any alternative future is where what is happening in Gaza is normalized, is frankly too bleak to contemplate.
Just list, because we're going to have to get on
so
to
very quickly, states can redouble their commitment to international law, number 1. They can intervene in the cases that are currently before the court, South Africa versus Israel, Nicaragua versus Germany, also Gambia, Myanmar. It's not about Gaza, but it is about the Genocide Convention, and it will determine the interpretation of the Genocide Convention going forward. They can bring forward further advisory opinions. Norway is indeed spearheading an initiative at the United Nations General Assembly in relation to the unprecedented attacks on UNRWA. Lawyers in domestic jurisdictions can bring cases. I myself am involved in a case in the United Kingdom challenging the UK's continuing exports of parts for fighter jets to Israel. And of course, it is not just about weapons. The advisory opinion, paragraphs 278 and 279, are clear that states need to reevaluate their dealings with Israel, whether they be cultural, military, political, economic, to ensure that they are not, in their dealings, upholding the illegalities.
Thank you very much. Minister Bello from Spain, let me bring you in here. Spain has joined the South African case about genocide. You have backed the General Assembly resolution which endorsed the International Court of Justice's ruling on occupied territory. But you and Spain, Norway, Ireland joined the many other states which have all recognized Palestinian statehood. We've had a very clear account of whether the legal tools are working. Was your recognition of statehood a symbolic move, or what do you think it has achieved?
Thank you. And we were party also to the advisory opinion on the occupied territories. I don't think it was symbolic. Of course, we don't think a state materializes out of thin air, and especially given the circumstances. But we thought that after these many years, after the Oslo agreement and negotiations, a peace process, of course, the process is supposed to have a term within your life. It's already been going on for 30 years and we see no outcome. So we thought that for those, in fact, holdouts, because Western countries, Western European countries were holdouts, Eastern Europe recognized in 1988, we needed to do something to break the impasse. We've been, in fact, managing this conflict for the last at least 20 years. There's been no real peace initiatives for a long time. And people may have thought that this was under control until last year, and then we had the worst crisis in recent memory. It's first the number of civilians killed in Israel, the number of civilians killed in Gaza, what's going on in the West Bank, first direct attacks between Iran and Israel. So clearly, the way we were doing things was an abject failure. So I understand that, and people say it's symbolic. In fact, when I hear it, we hear that even from counterparts. And when people tell you that something is symbolic or useless, I think it convinces me more of the usefulness, because if it's useless, nobody tells you, they just forget. And people keep reminding us. So we think it's useful. We think it's useful to keep the issue on the table. And what I'm speaking about the issue is the two-state solution. And quite frankly, in October, when we started discussing this at the European level, we insisted on putting the two-state solution on statements by the European Council. And it was a really strange feeling, because I've been following Middle East affairs for 20 years now. And one could feel that when Spain and Ireland and Slovenia, we started putting this on the table, some people look at us as if this were some kind of radical, strange idea. And even countries that have recognized Palestine, and countries whose position was that the end solution has to be a two-state solution, which are in fact all European countries. So that's we thought that it had to we had to bring a glimmer of hope first. That's for Palestinians, and also to remind people that we need to find a solution and not just ceasefire, which is very good, and I commend Qatar for all its efforts in trying to reach a ceasefire, the release of the hostages. But what we need to, in the midterm, is to move towards a two-state solution, and we all know the parameters, so there is no need to make anything up. And I think what's very simple is that we need to uphold international law, and that's all.
At the end of the day, as has been repeated time and again, and in effect it doesn't have to be, at the end of the day, it's Israelis and Palestinians who will have to make peace, and Spain, like all Western powers, wants to maintain relations with the Palestinians and with Israel. The then Foreign Minister Israel Katz said thank you for the service to Hamas. They called it anti-Semitic. How do you balance, at the same time that you need to send a very strong signal of the recognition of the aspirations of Palestinians, but you also have to work with Israel to achieve that? So how hard a diplomatic juggling act is that?
Yes, on anti-Semitism, we have the Spanish government has a very active policy against anti-Semitism. We are absolutely implacable against anti-Semitism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, whatever. So this is, there's a study by the University of Tel Aviv that in 2023, Spain was the country with the least number of anti-Semitic incidents as compared to the population. So the Jewish population in Spain is relatively small, but that's compared to the population. So, and I don't think that's the link to the fact that we've taken this position on defending also the rights of Palestinians. We don't feel, I said before, we're not taking sides. We are defending international law, international values, many countries, and in any case, all European countries say they defend. So we are doing in practical terms. We've done it with recognition. We've done it by defending funding for Palestine, for UNRWA, condemning the laws from the next set. And so this is not taking sides against Israel. And deeply convinced that the two-state solution is the best road ahead for the security of Israel as well. And we just have to see what happened in October 7th to see that the current path does not bring security to Israelis.
Good. So the recognition that was granted by the European states then brought the number in the General Assembly 146 out of 193. And of course, I think, Your Excellency, Minister Mrigi, some of you might say, well, what took you so long? You know, we've recognized them long ago. And Colombia has been one of the countries which has gone even further. You came out and said bluntly, what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. You cut diplomatic relations with Israel. You stopped your trade, your military trade. What do you think is being achieved by even taking a harder line on than your Spanish counterpart?
Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this with this distinguished panelist. Why did it took so long? It's like we recognized the Palestinian state in 2018. If you have resolutions from the UN that say that you have the two-state solution, you have to recognize the Palestinian state. It seems logical within the diplomacy of sincerity. We promote the diplomacy that is diplomacy for peace, to promote life, and you promote life when you protect the human rights of people and their dignity. And that's what President Petro has been saying. He said that before the October 7th at the UN, asking for a conference to talk about the Palestinian questions. But we need, obviously, to recognize that what is happening is a genocide. He said that first. Why? We need to remind the numbers. More than 45,000 people are being killed, assassinated, including babies, in the 21st century. That people, all the world is seeing. It's the first time that the world is seeing how the genocide is happening. And we need to say that straightforward. It's happening. More than 100,000 people also have been wounded. Here we heard this morning the journalists that have nothing to do with this conflict, just to inform. Humanitarian workers. We are seeing how hunger has been weaponized. And we are creating, in a very, in a high hypocrisy way, some alliance to fight hunger, when hunger has been weaponized within the eyes of everybody. That in the 21st century, we cannot allow to happen. And this is what Colombia is saying. 70% of those assassinated have been women and children. So that's the fact. That's the fact. That fact is challenging the rule-based international order. That's the preoccupation of Colombia. That could happen in the future to us when the international system have been unable to implement their own decisions. When one state is challenging the international system. Why is this challenging? Because there are and you mentioned that, there are third states that are supporting that genocide. That cannot happen.
So what do you...
In the 21st century, let me continue. And this is the legal order that have been challenged. What countries can do is some state is not behaving in the way it should to defend the rights and dignity of any person, human being. So what Colombia is doing? First, to say things as they are in a potent way. It's a genocide. Second, to take the measure that Colombia can take. We don't have the power of the global north. We don't have the money or the weapons or the political possibility of create coalitions. But at least what we can do is cut relations with those who are not behaving in a way it should behave in the 21st century. And this is not against the Israeli people or the Jewish people, because they are saying that Colombian government is anti-Semita. No. There is a government of Netanyahu that is behaving in that way. We cannot allow that to happen. Second, what we did, to support any action to stop the genocide, the action of South Africa, other action that be taken at the International Court of Justice. We support the warrant of arrest, not just to the Israeli leadership, but also Hamas. If they behave in a way they should not behave. So we support that at the International Criminal Court. We support the pronouncement of the UN. We do whatever is in our hand. We are providing, we don't have much money, but we are providing humanitarian assistance. We send some flights from Colombia to El Cairo, to Egypt. We send some flights to Beirut in Lebanon, and we have that much. How come countries that have the power to stop it are not doing it? And I get emotional with this because I'm coming from a people in Colombia, black people, that also have been in the middle of this situation. So this is in our government, the government of President Petro, we talk that way because in the 21st century, we cannot allow that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your strong statements. Mr. Barghouti, you've heard that I think the international community is using legal, political, diplomatic tools like they have never done before. Are they doing enough? And what more could be done from your Palestinian perspective?
Well, yes, Colombia is doing a lot.
And Spain?
The problem, and Spain is moving in the right direction, and Norway as well. But what about the rest of the world? What about the United States of America? What about Britain? What about Europe? And for us today, what I want everybody here to understand, we are the people who are facing now existential threat. A combination of 3 war crimes. The war crime of genocide, the war crime of collective punishment, including starving people now while we talk in the north of Gaza and everywhere in Gaza, including ethnic cleansing that is happening in front of the whole world. 7.5% of the Palestinian population in Gaza have been already killed or injured. If that had happened in the United States of America, you would be talking about 24 million people killed or injured in less than a year. Is that acceptable? And the question here is, why Israel is allowed to have this impunity? Why Israel is allowed to be above the law and above international law? Are we all equal human beings or not? At the end of the day, Elise, the question is, are we all equal human beings or not? Are we subhumans, as the Israelis are trying to say? And for how long the world can tolerate that? I think the war on Palestinians in Gaza and in Palestine in general is raising very major question for the whole globe, for international community. A big question. Why double standards? Why in the case of Ukraine, 11,000 sanctions on Russia and none on Israel? 57 years of military occupation, 76 years of displacement and ethnic cleansing. Why? The big question is, what is the right of self-defense? Is the right of self-defense, does the right of self-defense mean the right to commit crimes? And does it mean the right to defend crimes that Israel is committing? These are the big questions. Are we facing here only Israeli aggression and its impunity? Or actually, let's be frank, we are also facing racism, global racism against Palestinian people, and global racism and colonial ideology that is allowing the slaughtering of Palestinian people while the whole world is watching. So what is needed? It's what is needed. I mean, I thank you for everything you said about international law. I thank Colombia, I thank Spain for this, and Norway and others. But the big question is, for how long can you, the people of the world, tolerate the massacres that are happening every day? 50 to 100 people are killed every day. People are slaughtered around the clock. For how long this can be tolerated? And that's why our demand, Our demand is very clear. You want to apply international law, you want to claim that international law exists and international humanitarian law exists, impose sanctions and boycott on Israel now. This is the only way. This is the only way you can achieve a change. This is the only way you can influence the situation and you can make a difference, like Colombia did. And that's what we want. And let me say, those who keep speaking about two-state solution, honestly speaking, if you say two-state solution and don't demand the end of Israeli illegal occupation according to international law immediately, and the removal of Israeli illegal settlements from the occupied Palestinian territories, and the recognition immediately of Palestine, then this is not a call for two states. It's hypocrisy just to give Israel time to continue the annexation of Palestinian land. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you very much. Thank you. Daniel Levy, I know you're not here to speak on behalf of the Israeli government, but you have a very nuanced understanding of Israeli society, which includes, well, a certain community of peace activists, which includes lawyers, which includes people who are speaking up and have very strong views about this war. Perhaps you could sketch for us about how what you see coming out of Israeli society through this war.
Thank you, Liz, and it's an honor to be with these other panelists, and I strongly agree with what has been said by others on the panel today, and so I try and put that through the prism of what you asked, Liz, which is, can we connect that to what's going on in Israeli society? It is terribly depressing, the reality that there is something of a consensus, not wall to wall, but far more deep than one would like to imagine, that is not questioning what's going on in Gaza. There is a feeling that a social contract has been broken when it comes to the Israelis being held in Gaza, the indifference of the Israeli government to that is felt by many. But if I'm going to connect the threads, then what I would try and get across is, if you want to understand why the situation is so bad, yes, one goes to the history, which is long-standing. One has to bring in the factors that are more immediate. The Israeli media has played a really terrible role, and I think people will look at this. And in fact, some Israeli human rights NGOs, you mentioned those, have written to the Attorney General saying that Israel Channel 14 is operating as Radio Rwanda did in that genocide, in encouraging these crimes. But the heart, beyond that media coverage of why we are where we are, is everything that's been said here. It's one word. It's impunity. Because Israelis do not see cost or consequence, do not see an incentive structure which makes them question whether this is the right path. And I don't want to paint a distorted picture. Of course Israelis will turn around and say, you know, how dare they sanction this? And unfortunately it's been raised here. They will use the accusation of anti-Semitism, and I want to align with what Ministers Belio and Rogilo said. When you cheapen that accusation and you use it recklessly, something that is real and serious, like anti-Semitism, loses its meaning, and it undermines the struggle against anti-Semitism and racism. So I fundamentally believe that if one can change that incentive structure, then a cohort of Israelis will say, yeah, I don't like what they're doing. But they will also say, okay, maybe something is going wrong here. Maybe I have to think again. And when it comes to changing that incentive structure, we've heard it here, but maybe I can draw on the things that I think might be most impactful. First, I very much align with the geopolitics is shifting. And if the West is determined to prove to the world that international law, human rights, the UN Charter, the international court system are a con, then a world which sees a value in those things will have to double down in trying to make them meaningful, as we've heard from others. It's 70 years in April to Bandung, and the work of decolonization has not been finished. But I would also say this. and I don't think anyone does after the mobilizations we've seen, but let's double down on people power. Because we are all consumers of products. We all buy things. Some are unionized workers. We all consume media. And if our media is saying, well, we don't have anyone in Gaza, we can't use citizen journalists, that's not good enough. We make choices every day. There are sovereign wealth funds. Some people are sports fans. If the international sporting authorities are not going to do the right thing and say a country committing these crimes cannot participate as normal in sport, then just as done with South Africa, when it was protesters, it was fans who made normal sport impossible in an abnormal reality of apartheid and genocide, that has to happen again. And one can document, I think it was referenced here, one can document not just what the leadership is doing, but if Israeli soldiers are going to take to social media and post evidence of their own criminal activity, then as Blinne said, if they then want to travel, there are things that can be done via litigation today. They should be on notice. And the world should have an interest in putting guardrails around something that's paid insufficient attention to, that the killing fields of Gaza are testing out the weaponry of robotic, automated AI weapons, things like the Lavender system, that may be coming to a neighborhood near you very soon. And that should concern everyone. But I want to say one other thing, because that's one side of the equation, right? How we might change the Israeli incentive structure. But there has to be another side to that equation, and it's perhaps not talked about enough, and it's difficult to talk about. But Jewish Israelis will have to be offered a way out. Jewish Israelis will not be secure while Palestinians are living under a regime of structural violence and their rights are denied. But they need to know that they can be secure under a different reality. There's no two states on the table today, let's be honest. What might be on offer is the formalization of a Bantustan. And perhaps partition is driving this zero-sum reality of apartheid. So we need to sketch a future in which the replacing of an ethno-nationalist regime guarantees that after that is gone, Jewish Israelis will actually be more secure than they are today. That has to be on offer.
Okay.
I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but I think that is more realistic than the idea